So this week's speaker is Eric Ray from NOAA CSD in Karen Rosenloff's group. So just a little background on Eric. Eric got his bachelor's in physics and astrophysics from Berkeley, and then did his graduate work with Jim Holton at the University of Washington. Then he joined GMD with Jim Elkins before transitioning to Karen's group in 2001 in CSD. And when I was at NOAA, Eric's work was really interesting to me because he was using like CFC-11 and other surface measurements and pushing them really far. And I always thought, how could you get so much information out of stuff at the surface? So that's why I wanted to invite him today. And he's going to talk about some recent studies involving the unexpectedly interesting CFC-11. Take it away.
All right. Thanks, Nick. Can you guys hear me okay on that? Yeah. So I'll be talking about CFC-11 today. And it is a bit surprising that in this year, we're still talking about CFC-11 as much as we have been lately. So this is work I've done in collaboration with the people listed up here primarily. The sort of core of this is the surface observations. So Steve Monska, Jeff Dutton, really the ones responsible for that at NOAA GMD. And then down at my end of the building, Chemical Sciences Division, Bob Portman and John Daniel have been really good collaborators. They have a lot of experience with CFC-11 and this topic. So it's been a fun bunch of research we've done lately. So I'm going to go back and do a bit of history because I just can't help it. I really like history of things, and when I give a talk like this, I just kind of want to dig in a little bit, so we'll go back in time, so you have to indulge me. So this is a plot of CFC-11 going back to sort of the beginning of when it entered in the atmosphere, and I've cut it off into the early 80s. So trichlorofluoromethane is the name of this molecule. It was invented by Thomas Midgley in 1929 as a safe refrigerant. So people were getting hurt and dying from the gases that were used as refrigerants, so he thought that would needed to be fixed. He previously had discovered that adding lead to gasoline reduced knocking. And so this single person was responsible for just an incredible amount of environmental and health damage. It's startling. And so there was a good idea at the time. Yeah, it really did. So it wasn't his fault necessarily, right? And this was a quote from a biographer of his, that he had an instinct for the regrettable that was almost uncanny. So then if you go forward in time a bit, it started sort of an exponential growth of production and emissions. So if you move into the early 70s, the first atmospheric measurements were made by Lovelock in the early 70s. He was the inventor of the ECD, the electron capture detector. So that's how he was able to take these measurements. And so he published a couple times in the early 70s, and one of the quotes that he had in one of these papers was that the presence of these compounds constitutes no conceivable toxic hazard. Indeed, the interest lies in their potential usefulness as inert tracers. So he was excited about this, as a tracer of transport in the atmosphere. But this was sort of the first indication that CFC-11 wouldn't do as we expected, essentially. And so right away, Molina and Rowland had seen Lovelock's work, and so right away they started digging into it, realized that there was potential for the breakdown of these CFCs, CFC-11, 12, 113, in the stratosphere that could lead to the destruction of ozone. So this was a warning shot. CFC-11 it was still growing exponentially. Into the early 80s, we had the study by Prey. There was a 1D model study that showed that ozone loss could become significant. But at the current emission rates, it was thought maybe it's several decades. But then again, you go 1 year later, and the Farman study is out. And so he had the measurements over Antarctica that said, the 1D models aren't resolving this. We need to sort of understand this better because there is a tremendous amount of ozone loss over Antarctica. And so this is sort of overlaying then the total ozone at that time around the Farman study. So it was a huge drop, right, in spring ozone over Antarctica. This is October. Okay, and so this just sort of puts on the timeline again. So the warning was here. still really wasn't an ozone hole at that time. And then in the next decade, it really occurred rapidly. And so there was the Prather study, Farman, and then Susan's study a year later, sort of making the implication of the heterogeneous chemistry in the vortex. So that got the ball rolling towards the Montreal Protocol relatively fast after that, right, 87. At the same time the protocol was signed, the AAOE mission was happening down in Antarctica, where they were actually taking measurements of ozone and chlorine and provide the smoking gun. But this was literally the same month as the protocol was signed. So there was action taken before like all the evidence was in. Okay, so moving on then, the effect of the protocol and some of its amendments were to sort of tail off the production of CFC-11. Jim Elkin's paper in '93 sort of noted the turning over of the CFC-11, and so this is into the early 90s. And so it was also warned us, Molina and Rowland, back in '74 that it would require a lot of time to recover from the CFCs that you're putting in the atmosphere, on the order of the calculated lifetimes. And that's 50 years roughly for F11, 100 years for CFC-12, so a long time to recover. And so the ozone hole will persist for a while, and that is indeed what has happened. So my history with this began in the late 90s. So when I first went to NOAA, I was helping to operate a gas chromatograph with electron capture detectors that was flying on a balloon. And so the bottom plot there, those are two plots from a paper that I was first author on in '99. And so we had balloon measurements going up into the stratosphere. So this was in this slow decline of CFC-11. It was essentially an ideal tracer of transport in the stratosphere and into the upper troposphere even. So this was a study that was sort of trying to get at the transport in that region, and it was great for that. And I think most of us just expected that CFC-11 would tail off slowly because of its long lifetime and the slow release from the banks. So wherever CFC-11 is used, it takes a long time to escape from that. So 3 to 5% a year, emissions come from the banks, and then the slow decline based on the lifetime. Anyway, so if you know the banks, you know, and you know the known production, say, and the atmospheric lifetime, you should be able to predict the future of this molecule, essentially. And so that's what was done in the early ozone reports. So this is an ozone assessment from 2002. And so that red line is the prediction from that time. But if you step forward, the prediction is still reasonable at this point. So this is going to 2006. 2010, you can see there's a bit of a difference then between that blue line is the actual measured CFC-11 and the predictions that were made earlier. And then you step forward more and you can see a bit of more of a difference, right? So every time you make the prediction at some period in the future time, the prediction is lower than we've seen. And then we move up to the most recent one, and again, it's not what was predicted. Part of this is due to lifetime differences in the predictions that we have come to know now, and parts just due to other aspects. So this is another surprising part of CFC-11. It has not gone to prediction over the whole last 2 decades. Essentially, we haven't been able to predict it. Okay, so that moves us to the recent time. And so if we go back, so now this is a slightly different way of looking at the F11. This is a growth rate. So it's percent per year, so it's annual growth rate. And it's just from 1995 up to about 5 years ago. And so this is about the time when Steve was noticing something different happening in CFC-11. So around 2014-15, he noticed that the growth rates were starting to move up. They were less negative, right? So they were down around minus 0.8 for this period of time, and then they did a bit of a jump. And so you'll notice that there's this significant 2 to 3 year variability throughout the time series. And so initially, there was just enough concern about this being just dynamics that we started looking into it, and sort of Steve came down and asked for our help in sort of figuring out what the dynamical part of the signal could be. And so we studied it for a while, and then a few years went by, and it was still up there. And so the answer turned out to be that it is both dynamical variability, but there also was an emission increase. And the emission increase is a big story, right? Because that's a violation of the Montreal Protocol if there's excess production going on and new emissions of CFC-11 that shouldn't be happening. All right, so we chase that down. This is a figure from the Manska et al. Nature paper in 2018. So this is kind of the key message, was that the emissions were declining as expected generally with the reported production up until sometime in the early 2000s. It became kind of level, but then in that 2013-14 period, there was a big jump up, right? So the quantification of this was to take the average from 2002 to 12, and then difference that from what we saw in 2014 to 16, and we got that 13 gigograms per year increase. That's significant, but we did some modeling runs that suggested that some of that change in the growth rate was due to some change in dynamics, some effect from the stratosphere. So the quote in the paper is that this emission increase may be up to 50% smaller as a result of stratospheric processes or dynamics. So we've since come to a different understanding of the model results, but I'll just say that this was sort of the most high-profile work I've ever been involved in. I think we knew this was going to be a big story as we were doing it. So we were being careful. Steve obviously did a nice job putting it together, and it did get a lot of attention. So these were some of the headlines around the world, right? The paper came out, and then New York Times, BBC. It's a mystery. It's a whodunit story. There were some investigations into what was going on. The paper pointed towards sort of Southeast Asia, East Asia, China in general, but we couldn't pin it down too well. But this organization, Environmental Investigation Agency, nonprofit, they actually sent people to China and were digging around trying to figure out what was going on. And mostly, it's expected that this is due to foam blowing. That's where they were thought to be using most of the CFC-11. But it's still not known entirely. An interesting aspect, if you have a really popular paper, is that you can get in this altmetric top 100, which is some indication of the popularity in general, overall sort of mentions and whatever it is, I don't even know. We just made the list, 96 of 100, there we are. But we were not as popular as a study on wine glass size in England over the last few centuries, right? So that puts it in perspective. But anyway, it was quite popular. We won this award, a governor's award for high impact research last year. It's pretty exciting. And then China had a response, at least in some of their publications. They were giving an indication that they were concerned, that it was pointing towards China and that China was going to respond. And then a subsequent paper came out last year, sort of pinning down the increase of these emissions to this specific region in eastern China, at least about half of the increase in emissions, so 7 plus or minus 3. They did a sort of attribution study with back trajectories from the site in South Korea, and sort of pinned it down to that part of China, so very quite specific. So now if we move a little bit forward, this is a bit of an update from that figure from the paper, and it can show that it goes through 2018. So those excess emissions have persisted through at least 2018. There will be an update coming through 2019 in a new work that Steve's putting together. And we're trying to also pin down a little better what we expected the emissions to really be? What was this flattening of the emissions expected as well? So Bob Portman is working on that aspect. So these are both in preparation, and I can't really show you that today, but that's a stay tuned message on more to this story. It is interesting, I'll just say that. Okay, so my specialty is more the dynamics. So I'm gonna sort of move into the dynamical part of using CFC-11. And so I'll go back to this growth rate plot. So this is again from 95 till up in the recent times. And you see this variability on the 2 to 3 year scale. And so what causes this?
Actually, another question is,
Yeah.
you have this flattening out from, between 2001, 2002, over to 2013 when the growth rate starts going up. So what caused that drop? Why did it stay flat? And then there's the question of why it went back up.
Yeah, so this drop was more expected just based on the reported production. And it's heading towards its, if there were no emissions, it would head down to roughly minus 2% per year. That's its atmospheric lifetime of roughly 50 years. So we would expect this to sort of, there'll still be bank emissions for quite a while, but this should asymptote down to minus 2 at some point in the future. And that's what those predictions from the assessments were doing, essentially, is that kind of, but yeah, none of the predictions had this flat period for a decade. And certainly none of them would have expected it to go up again, and that's because there just was no reported production past, roughly 2005-06 range. I don't know if that's what so this part was expected. This wasn't really predicted, and then that absolutely was an obvious issue.
So it seems like that flattened part there, the lower part, is just as important as the rise because you're comparing the rise to that.
Yeah.
That's just as important.
Yeah, I agree.
Maybe it should have been farther down. Like maybe the rise is actually even more than what you think it is.
Yeah, that's a good point. So you'll notice there's a couple of lines on here of coming off of the observed sort of emissions that are based on growth rate. Where should that have been? If there was only this reported production, right? It went up to 2008-09. There was still a tiny bit, but it was essentially done by 2006-07, whatever. So this is saying, yeah, if we have no new production, you could have a bank release that could just give you this type of emission future. This is coming off a little later and is a similar type of thing, just saying, well, if we had a bank release only from this point, then it would do something like this. But you're right, like where do we go from here? This is part of the work that Bob Portman is doing. So he's trying to pin this down a little better to get an expectation. It's not trivial, actually. There's enough uncertainties in enough of the parameters, the production, the bank release, the size of the bank, the lifetime, that quantifying what you would expect is a tough problem, but we're definitely working on that, because you're right. This is something we noticed way back, like why is, ever since this became flat, why is it flat? That was not part of any of the predictions.
You have a big enough bank, it can stay pretty flat for a long time.
Yeah, so the bank size is important, and yeah, this assumes some bank, bank size that's based on the production and some bank release rate that can be variable. So yeah, this is just giving you an estimate of a 3% bank release based on some estimated bank size that we don't know. So yeah, that's another uncertainty in the whole problem. Yeah, so that emission side of things has been a good puzzle to work on, certainly. Yeah, and feel free to ask questions, by the way. But anytime, I don't need to get through all the slides. I'll go through some of the published stuff and then move on to stuff that's a little more in process at the end. Okay, well, so this is a global average growth rate. at the surface, right, of CFC-11. If you go to the individual sites, so these are individual NOAA GMD measurement sites, and it looks a little spaghetti-ish, but generally what you see is that there is some coherence, like between sites within the southern hemisphere and the northern hemisphere. There's a coherence between those types of anomalies, and this is remove the seasonal cycle. If I left the seasonal cycle in, as I mentioned here, it'd be 2 to 3 times as big, right? So this is sort of a secondary anomaly at the surface to the seasonal cycle, but the seasonal cycle isn't quite as important when you're talking about deriving emissions. This is really sort of variability that comes into the emission calculation. So it's apparent in all the sites. It's phased differently in each hemisphere. It seems to be generally larger amplitude in the southern hemisphere. And the coherence suggests that there's a common cause, right? That it's not all just noise that we're seeing there. So the way we went about this was we wanted to focus on this 1 to 5 year variability. So we subtract out this sort of long-term 5-year running mean. And so we're focusing on the anomalies in this 1 to 5 year. We did sort of bandpass, and that's what this is. So this is now just the anomalies. This is just the southern hemisphere average now. And this is F11, but if you do this for other trace gases, you can see some similarities. These are other long-lived trace gases, right? You have CFC-12 in the green and N2O in the red. These are also long-lived, and so if you have some dynamical source of this variability, you expect it to be there in all these tracers. Like this should be sort of common variability if it's coming from where these trace gases are lost, and I'll get into that soon too. But anyway, this coherence is also there among all the tracers. So we weren't the first ones to see this. If you go all the way back to this Elkin study I mentioned in '93, so he noticed that there's a good correlation between the QBO winds and the drop, especially in the southern hemisphere growth rates of the CFCs. And more recently, Cynthia Nevison has done really nice work on correlating N2O in particular, but also F12, with the interannual variability in stratosphere, and it was represented by a polar low stratosphere temperature. So some nice correlations, seasonally broken out by Cynthia there. Ozone, so it's hard to see ozone variability at the surface, but this is sort of comparing lower stratosphere to upper troposphere in the blue and the red, and you see similarities there. So it just gets partway down in ozone. And then beryllium-7. So this is a gas it's essentially, it's produced in the lower stratosphere, and so it's different sort of signal than some of these others. But anyway, this is suggestive, this recent paper, that at the surface you also see beryllium-7 QBO signal. Okay, but so our focus to sort of help out the original, so the Monska paper, was to do some modeling work and try to derive the dynamical variability as best we could so that we could account for it when doing the emissions estimates. And so we did this number of studies. So it was fairly extensive model work where we used CAM5 and WACM. We used various inputs, a variety of nudging techniques, and then some different emission distributions. I'll say that this modeling work was driven primarily by Peng-Fei Yu and Nick Davis. Neither of them are at NOAA anymore, but they were really the engines of this and did a tremendous amount of work to help with it. Nick has a paper that just got published today, talking about nudging of WACM, and this was sort of one of the rabbit holes we got off on this project, and he did a great job sort of digging into that and describing it really well. So what I'll talk about then in the next little part is this paper I had come out last year, where we use the WACM only QBO nudged run, otherwise free running. So no nudging with MERA. The key to this, to get the signal at the surface, so we had to use emission-based based boundary conditions instead of a mixing ratio, which most people use, especially for these types of tracers. Had to do that to get the feedback at the surface from the stratospheric dynamics. We put in an emission time series based on smoothed growth rates from the observations. So as I said, it was free running model. This one had climatological sea surface temperatures. All right, so just to look a little bit at what's happening in the stratosphere then. So we need to know about the stratospheric transport for these tracers because that's where all the loss is happening essentially. So this is showing you latitude, pressure, cross-section of the average loss of both F11 and F12 in a Wacom run that we did. So you can see it's focused, it's mostly concentrated on the tropical sort of mid-stratosphere, and essentially all the losses in the stratosphere. And then here's the mean circulation, right? So you have circulation through the loss region, and that really affects how much loss you have year to year. And that loss is then transported down into the polar regions and out to the troposphere, where it's measured at the various surface sites. So looking at this sort of, the anomaly that the QBO, so the QBO is this quasi-biennial oscillation in the winds. I'm not showing you that at the moment, but essentially I'm showing you the transport anomaly that it causes in the stratosphere, and this is right in the heart of the loss region. So the QBO is this westerly, easterly wind pattern that descends in the tropics. So this is one particular time where you have westerly shear, and that causes an anomalous downward circulation in the tropics and upward in the subtropics. So this thing's moving down right through the loss regions of these tracers, perturbing the loss, and then that's advected out and away and down. So that's the start of this pattern. And now I'll show you, it's pretty interesting just to look at a movie of these anomalies. So let me just show you what I'll describe it a little bit first. So this is now CFC-11 partial pressure anomaly. So we did partial pressure because it's hard to track an anomaly all the way down from the mid-stratosphere to the surface if you're just talking about mixing ratio or some other quantity. This was really the ideal one to track it all the way. These are anomalies then from the mean. So positive anomalies in the red, and these are nanopascals, and negative in the blue. In the purple line there is the tropical zonal wind. So this is showing you what the QBO is. So at this point, it's essentially minus 30-ish at this level, and then it moves to positive westerlies, right? So there's easterly over westerly, and that's just to give you an idea that what the QBO is doing as the anomalies are propagating. And then, so you can see the anomalies are present in the troposphere, right? So the blue means there's in general a negative anomaly at this time. But so as we move through, let's see, you can kind of see how the anomalies propagate. All right, there we go, come on. All right, so it's hard to watch everything at once. I can play it a couple times, but you can see the QBO sort of moving. The anomalies starting in the tropics, and the anomalies up in that region don't really make it out. The lifetime is a little too short up there, but then as you move down, the lifetime becomes longer, and the anomalies sort of propagate out into the extratropics. So if you look at any particular part, like especially in the northern hemisphere, if you look down at the tropopause, that orange line is the tropopause, I'll play it again, you can see the anomalies sort of dumping out into the troposphere, right, from the lowermost stratosphere. So there's a negative. They dump in the lowermost stratosphere, and then seasonally they dump out into the troposphere, and it eventually fills the troposphere. Okay, so that's roughly the pattern that we're talking about of how the anomalies get from the QBO region out into the polar region, down into the troposphere, and fill the troposphere. So that's roughly what I said. So you start with photochemical loss, and then it's dominated by advection. You have to have both those things happening. This is what it looks like then in the global mean. So these are partial pressure anomalies right now. Now it's a function of time. and pressure. So you can see these are the QBO winds in the sort of purple, pink, green, westerly, easterly. And every QBO cycle, right, you start off these anomalies, they start up in the middle stratosphere and they propagate all the way down to the surface. So every one, and this is the QBO-driven free-running model. And it takes approximately 3 years. There's some variability between 2.5 and 3.5, roughly. All right, so you can break this down a little bit into, this is a total, this is roughly what I showed before, and this is just the loss term. So you can see the loss, the photochemical loss part of the signal is just dominated by this upper part, and then the rest, and the scale is different. So this is dominating the very upper part of the signal, and then all the rest of this is advection of that down. We can look at a composite. So this is going to be a composite of at each maximum at the surface. What does it look like all the way up as a function of latitude now? You can do it for both. So this is showing you then what at any one time when it's positive throughout the troposphere, a positive anomaly, this is the pattern in the stratosphere. So you can see there's at any one time, there's essentially 2 QBO signals present in the stratosphere, right? 2 full cycles. There's a negative, positive, negative, positive. So it's starting there and then transporting out. And you see the loss term is really confined to that region that I showed earlier, where the loss of F11 is dominant. And then that becomes essentially negligible as you move down.
Eric,
Yeah.
this surface signal doesn't look like it's coming continuously from across the tropopause. It looks like it appears at the surface or something, amplifies. Do you see that? Or do you agree with that, Mike?
Okay, well in that movie, I think what you could see, at least what the model seems to be doing, is it loads up the lowermost stratosphere over the winter, and then it was dumping it out of a pretty narrow latitude band. And there was a continuous sort of anomaly feature that then filled up the troposphere. The thing that you have to consider also is that partial pressure is not necessarily a conserved quantity. So you don't necessarily, so as the pressure increases and you have the same mixing ratio anomaly, those partial pressure anomalies will actually increase. So you might have been noticing some of that effect. So could be those things. But as far as we can tell, yeah, it's a continuous sort of evolution of the anomalies all the way down through the stratosphere and to the surface. Okay, the other way to look at this is you can follow one of these all the way down, right? So we can do a composite based on the positive phase, essentially. So the composite is made up of different times in this case. And also, it's interesting to note, I mentioned this before, but the descent times are somewhere in this 2.5 to 3.5 year range. So these are the times starting at 10 of how long it took the anomaly to get to the surface. So the average is something like 3 years to get down. So here's the composite if you look at the different times. So on the right axis there, it's the descent time, right? Because these are all different times. And then this is pressure and latitude. So this sort of shows the pathway then of the anomalies down into the troposphere. It's interesting that this region, right, doesn't really contribute. It's really a polar transport-dominated anomaly. That's different from the seasonal cycle. Okay, so these now, if you just go down to the surface of the model, so we're going to look at the anomalies globally averaged at the surface. So these are what you get for the 3 tracers we had in that model run, right? F11, F12, and 2O. And so very coherent again, down at the surface. I've put on here the QBO zonal winds with some lag just to give you an indication that it's highly correlated, as you would expect. Okay, and also in this paper, we looked at what the effect is then on the global emission estimates that you would derive from these growth rates, right, from the model. So essentially the model input, so this is an emission time series from the model. The input that we put in is the black. And then if you derive from the model growth rates of CFC-11, say the 1 year smoothed growth rates, you'd get the emission curve in the red there. So that just shows you the sort of range of anomaly uncertainty, error that you incorporate due to the stratospheric variability that comes to the surface. You can get around that somewhat by smoothing, right? The more you smooth, the closer you're going to get to the long-term smooth emission input, but it's still not perfect. And then if you do this for all the tracers, you look at the emission anomaly due to transport, essentially. So there's an error due to the QBO. The QBO is the only thing in this model that's causing this. This gives you the scale of those emission uncertainties. And they're not insignificant. So, for F11, this is 5 to 7, 8 gigograms per year. And the total emission now is, that 50 to 60 gigograms per year range. So it's a significant variability on that. Same for N2O, 2 to 3 teragrams per year. And that's on the order of the size of, some of the important terrestrial sources of N2O. So it is important to account for this, I think, was the main point of the paper. All right, so now I'm going to move a little bit on to work that's in progress. And one of the aspects of that is, in the paper, I didn't really show directly the comparison between the surface anomalies from the observations and those in the model. They were sort of plotted on the same page, but not directly compared, okay? And the reason was that they didn't compare well. That wasn't necessarily the point. The point of the paper was just sort of to get the amplitude of these anomalies. But I'm plotting them together here because it is interesting to see the difference. So these are now the global growth rates of F11 from the observations in the purple dashed, and from this QBO free running run that I just showed you the results for that were in the paper. So they don't phase up too well in general. So there seems to be some issue with modeling the transport of these anomalies from their start, right, in the tropical middle stratosphere down to the surface. And it's not surprising. That's a 3-year transport time. You have to get a lot right to get this signal right. There are times when it phases really well. You'll notice the last 2 QBO cycles seems to be doing quite well. That's a nice coincidence. But if you go back further, that's not necessarily the case. We have a bunch of other runs. I'm going to show you just a couple others here. This is when we add in sea surface temperature variability, so theoretically an ENSO signal, which can have an effect on the stratospheric circulation. That's in the green. So it doesn't seem to really help with the phasing, and it sort of increases the amplitude beyond the observations more than not. So that's an interesting one. You notice, though, there's one difference, like 2016-ish. It adds an anomaly that you see in the observations. And then if we add one of these, a nudged run, right? This is MERA2, winds and temperature nudging, so that's this orange one. And again, so it's not necessarily helping with the phasing too much. It's bringing the amplitude down a bit closer to the observations in general, but still not perfect.
Is this one ensemble member you're showing?
This is one ensemble, yeah. Yeah, we have a lot of different nudged runs. So I don't know if you would consider that an ensemble, but I could have shown lots of different anomaly time series on this from the different model runs, and they all tend to have the same type of feature where they phase up occasionally and in those most recent cycles really well, but then the rest of the time series can be pretty far off. And just this is to show you that, you know, the correlations. So this is observed, so these are the time series I just showed you, point by point now, observed versus modeled. Right, so the correlations are not good as you would expect. But this just shows how far, so the correlations from the QBO only are higher than when you add in the SST. And then the nudge run is slightly better, but none of these are really going to do the job if you're trying to really nail down what the stratospheric influence is at the surface in any particular year. These models are challenged to do that. And it's
Explain again the difference between the purple and the green. Do they both have a data ocean?
So the purple has a climatological ocean. So that means it has a seasonal cycle, otherwise climatological. So no ENSO. That's the big one for the stratospheric circulation. And the green adds in the data. So theoretically, an accurate sea surface temperature variability that has ENSO in it. So it's obviously perturbing the model transport a bit, but seems to be amplifying it. So otherwise, the model's free running. So this is just QBO, winds nudged, and sea surface temperature nudged, otherwise free running. So that's the green, yeah. So there's a lot more to do with digging into the model variability. We have a lot of runs, and I'm just curious to know what's going on. So I'm sort of partway through that work. Another aspect of this that I've been working on is satellite observations can sort of get at some of the stratospheric variability. So I've been using MLS and ACE measurements. So you can see we now have a pretty nice time series from these satellites of CFC-11, CFC-12, N2O. It goes through 6 complete QBO cycles now. So we can do sort of a similar thing with these trace gases from the satellite as I did for the model, where I could do a global average partial pressure anomaly. And these all start around 2004 and go to now. And so this is from ACE. So ACE sampling is weighted heavily towards the exotropics. So this is unfortunately going to be, it's tricky to get the start of the signal from ACE in the tropics. But as you move down, ACE goes quite low into the lowermost stratosphere. And so it has a pretty nice coherent signal for the most part with most QBO cycles there. You can compare this to F12. So F12, the loss is a little higher, so the anomalies start a little higher, and they're also quite coherent and similar to F11. If you compare, the anomalies are generally similar. MLS, N2O, again, a little bit higher where the anomalies start, and MLS has good coverage throughout all latitude range, so it really gets the start of these anomalies quite well in MLS, but unfortunately it stops at about 70 millibars. So you don't get the transport down into the lowermost stratosphere that would be helpful. All right, so you can also look at a composite of N2O in this way, where I'm just looking at this is a maximum essentially of the global average partial pressure anomalies from up where the anomalies start. So again, you can see this pattern of the anomalies that's present in the stratosphere at any one time and in N2O as well. And so the interesting thing, so this pattern, right, this is real world observation. So how much of this pattern is due to the QBO? And one way to get at that is to correlate all those time series anomalies from every location with the QBO zonal winds, right? So this, and with a variety of lags. So I'm just trying to get at what is the effect of the QBO on this anomaly pattern. Where are the highest correlations? And as you would expect, the tropics where the QBO is dominating. The QBO is dominating that. So these are very high correlations. These are 0.9 or higher. And then sort of lower correlations into some of the exotropics, but high again as you move out, especially into the southern hemisphere. So this is showing sort of the remote connection between these anomalies in the vortex region and the high latitudes, especially in the south, with the QBO winds. All right, so the QBO is still having this effect as the anomalies propagate down. But if you go down to the surface, which is what we're interested in if we're trying to get at what's causing those anomalies down at the surface, so that the correlation pattern changes. So this is a correlation now with the southern hemisphere surface, with, again, all the anomalies of N2O throughout the stratosphere. So you can see it shifts down. So you lose most of the tropical correlation, and the pattern shifts down, and it shifts even into higher latitudes, so into the vortex. So the highest correlations with the surface, as the anomalies propagate down the stratosphere, they're modified somewhat. So it's not a pure QBO signal anymore. But this is getting closer then to what you see, what's coming out of the stratosphere. And it's concentrated in the high latitudes, right in the vortex. And I should say that this sort of transport feature, Susan Strawn had a nice paper a few years ago that described the N2O measurements and how the QBO sort of affected the transport from the tropics to the edge of the vortex. And then as the season went on and the vortex broke down, those anomalies would move into the high latitudes and then down. So she pointed this feature out in that paper. It was quite nice. Okay, so then this is N2O from MLS. If you go to ACE, F11, you lose the tropics because ACE just has no coverage essentially there. But you fill in the lowermost stratosphere region. So now this is F11 though, right? A little different from F12, but the anomaly pattern should hold generally with all these tracers. So now you just get this column of this anomaly, high correlations with the surface, that's just coming right down through the vortex into the lowermost stratosphere, right down to the tropopause, right? So this is the highest correlations are here to the last part that the stratosphere, modifies before it hits the surface, and in both hemispheres. So this is interesting. This is a little bit of transport then from the northern stratosphere that can come into the troposphere and then move to the southern hemisphere, right? There's some interhemispheric transport time delay on that. So what we're interested in then is how can we use these measurements to sort of get the anomaly at the surface that's due to this. So these are the lag times then associated with these maximum correlations. So in this region in the vortex, this sort of reddish color, that's two years roughly. So we can take that and use those hot spots with the lag and do a multiple linear regression and try to derive the anomaly at the surface based on that. So that is this shown here for N2O. So the measurements, these anomalies at the southern hemisphere surface are in red, and then the prediction from this regression is in orange, right? And these are what we used as predictors, one in the southern hemisphere, one in the northern hemisphere with the lags. Okay, so this does pretty well. Overall, the correlation is shown over there. That's actually the R squared. It's quite high, explains a lot of the variance. And the other aspect of this that's pretty interesting is since these patterns come from the stratosphere, and we can observe the stratosphere now, we know what's coming, right? So this will propagate down over the next 2 years. And that's our prediction of the next 2 years in the dashed line, and what will be the anomaly at the southern hemisphere surface in 2020 and even into 2021. We can also do this, so I'm just saying what I said there. We can do this for F11 as well. And so again, these are overlaying those ACE correlations. They're focused way down in the lower stratosphere, and we're going to use these spots way down here where the lag is quite short now, right? The lag there is 6 months-ish, and it's close to a year, maybe, I think it's 16 months from the northern hemisphere. And so we're going to do a similar thing with F11. And so that's shown here. Again, for the southern hemisphere, measured anomalies in red, predicted in orange. And the base for the regression there. So again, it's doing quite well, even a little better. And the prediction can't go as far, though, for this because we're using these locations in the stratosphere that are closer to the surface. But we can predict out into 2020 at least. That's the shape of the anomaly. Okay, so that's generally the work. I'm just going to wrap it up there. So that's the last part I showed is ongoing work. We're hoping to finish up some of that. All right, so just a summary. The main result from all this was that there were unexpected new emissions and production of F11, right? That's a breach of the Montreal Protocol. we will be having some updates from the most recent measurements in preparation. So that is also quite interesting work to see how it's evolving. All right, so I showed the QBO, anomalies, and so I think we're pretty confident now. We've shown quite clearly that both in models and observations, there's a significant and persistent effect on the surface variability of the long-lived trace gases. And so the stratospheric measurements from satellites are quite valuable, I think, for both verifying the model and for making predictions of surface influence. And so I think that's what I said there. So anyway, I will stop there. Thanks.
Questions?
I can just yell, I'm loud. So my question is about the, my question's about the annual cycle, which you've taken out the annual cycle. But the QBO is like a 10% anomaly, and the annual cycle is a larger signal. So can you say the same things you said about the annual cycle on these species at the surface, for example?
There is a definite effect of the annual cycle on these species, and it is quite large. And that's been known and studied for quite a while. Yeah, I mean, the CFCs, it's the dominant driver of the seasonal cycles, the stratospheric mass flux anomaly, and it is much bigger than this signal. Generally, though, when the focus is on emissions, you're not including a seasonal cycle when you're calculating emissions, or it's removed a little easier, I guess. So that, I haven't focused at all on that. There's been a fair amount of work on the seasonal cycle effect of the stratosphere on the surface, and it's definitely there, and it's quite large. It's easier to handle in a sense than this anomaly. Yeah.
Okay.
So now that you've done this nice work on correlating the tracers from the stratosphere down to the surface, presumably you could do the same thing, and probably are doing it, with Wacom to try to understand this problem with the Wacom lags. Can you say a little bit about that? I presume you're finding a time scale issue there, that Wacom doesn't get the stuff there.
Yeah, I haven't gotten too far on that. That is the obvious thing to do, because
Yes, it is.
because one thing that you want to know is, what are the limits of this technique, essentially, from the observations? Can you get all of the variability at the surface? Should you expect to? You shouldn't really. There's obviously going to be tropospheric variability that's going to affect some of this interannual anomaly. So yeah, what I've seen so far in the model is that I don't get correlations any higher than the observational derived correlations, right, from the model. There's enough variability in the model also that you can't necessarily use the best correlation to get all of the variability at the surface. So there is some limit to it. There are other techniques I'm starting to use. There's a technique called dynamical time warping. So this is, instead of using one fixed lag over a whole multi-decade record, some of these anomalies will travel down faster or slower than others. We saw that with the model sort of transport times. They're all out between 2.5 and 3.5 years. Sometimes you can phase up the individual or two cycles with one lag that's different from the next cycle and on. You can increase the correlations using these sort of lag shifting techniques. So there are ways to optimize this that I'm sort of getting into now that I think have some promise. So that's another part of it, getting to.
So the standard version of Wacom has mixing ratio, lower boundary condition for CFCs. I'm assuming you have changed that to a flux and sinks for what your work?
Yeah, it's a flux. Yeah, it's an emission flux.
How do you treat the sinks, and how well do you know those?
So in the stratosphere, you mean?
At the surface.
So the surface sinks, I don't know that, I think they're pretty small. There's some transfer with the ocean, but I don't know if that's even in somebody who's doing the modeling work would actually know better than me. I don't know if Nick does or not. But my understanding is that those are small. And I don't know the details, to be honest.
Hi, I have an answer for your question.
All
so
right.
I work with CO2 before, also using fluxes, and you can simply set the emissions to be negative. It will just withdraw the concentration on the surface.
Yeah, I don't know if that exchange with the ocean has much influence on the magnitude of anomalies we're seeing here. It's pretty dominated by that stratospheric loss term, I think, for F11. Yeah.
So in one slide, you showed that the model doesn't agree with the anomalies near the surface compared to observations.
Yeah.
And you said it was for one ensemble member. Have you played around, besides running more ensemble members, have you played around with how you nudge the model? Like the width of the, because you probably relax the Singapore winds, right? In some way, nudge to them?
That is the general QBO nudging is, it's a relaxation
I think
and
there's some
latitude.
sensitivity on how you do the width of that nudging, and that may affect some of the anomalies and how they penetrate down into the troposphere.
That could be, I think, I showed a range. So there was even the UVT anomaly. The UVT nudging nudges at all locations, right? So it's not just, so the one in the paper was just the QBO winds, and you're right, there's some sort of width of that nudging of the tropical winds. But the full nudging run nudges the winds and temperature everywhere, right, throughout the stratosphere. So I don't know if that QBO...
That's your SD run, though, right?
That's SD run. I did show one SD run
Yeah.
on there, and the phasing was still off, essentially, most of the time. It damped the amplitude a lot, the SD run, but the phasing was still a problem.
I have a question. That
Yeah.
N2O correlation plot you showed, we have a clean signal in the pipe and then at the pole.
Yeah.
I don't know, the paper you're referring to was the idea that mixing scrambles the signal on its way out of the pipe and then it just pops up? Or is
Yeah,
that just a...
So why the correlations are small outside of the, that paper didn't necessarily talk about, what's going on here. It was just more like, we see a correlation between the measurements here and what's happening with the QBO there. Like your QBO cycle to QBO cycle is just sort of this correlation that was distinct. I think what happens out here, so you're in the surf zone, I think a lot of the anomalies are just getting wiped in a sense. And that's why in the north, you have sudden warmings and all sorts of things happening there on an interannual timescale that are just sort of damping the anomaly quite a bit that you don't have as much here. So yeah, that paper was sort of just describing how there is a connection here to here. But yeah, this is a different thing. And I think it's just the surf zone mixed out. They don't persist there for too long, right? They go through there, and then they're sort of destroyed before they get to, they make it out here, but they don't sit there and propagate down from there or anything. They're sort of destroyed quickly.
It's probably also a path problem. Like stuff will always go through the pipe and end up at the pole, but how it might even get there probably changes year to year in the surf zone. So
Yeah, I think there's that too. Yeah.
Anyone else?
I think there was one more.
First of all, every time I hear presentations like this, I feel pretty bad because my home country is anyway.
Oh no.
Well, the question is regarding the interactions with the ocean. I know it's probably going to be a pretty small player, but since I could be wrong, but I don't think these things are actually produced in the ocean. Therefore, the atmosphere is supersaturated with respect to the ocean. As a result, if you have stronger emissions in certain areas, the ocean surrounding that region would have a stronger tendency to uptake.
Yeah.
And then since the tropospheric lifetime is so long that it's pretty much well mixed, my gut feeling is it has a bigger chance to be uptaking in the ocean. While if you're talking about transporting to the stratosphere, there are only a couple of hotspots that are very active in terms of transporting to the stratosphere. Mike, I'm curious, like you said, ocean is going to be a small player, I agree, but how small are we talking about? Like 1%, like 10% or something like that? And we now have a tool set that can look into that. I'm just curious if it's worth doing that at all.
My impression would be on the 1% level. I don't know if, Steve, do you know any more about?
Solubility of F11 seawater is pretty low, so there's not a large mass of F11 in the ocean.
Okay.
Surface layer. How large is it compared to the atmospheric mass? I don't know that number offhand.
Okay.
You could find it out because John Bolster's scripts have done lots of measurements using F11 as an ocean tracer.
Okay.
So
There's been a lot of work looking at F11 in the water to see that it, it's super saturated and undersaturated depending on season because the temperature of the waters are changing seasonally.
Uh-huh.
So we know about it. We can figure it out.
Yeah. So that's not a great answer, maybe, but I think it's in the lowest sort of noise level. But it could be, there could be regions and times when it's more important, yeah.
One other quick point.
Yeah?
Let's not forget that the measurements aren't perfect. It's nice that you show them there and you want that line to match up perfectly, but you're talking about small differences from year to year, and they're not perfect. Just leave it at that. For our consistency, be able to understand
Yeah.
how things are actually changing from year to year, it's a difficult thing to do.
That is true. Thanks.
Is it quick? You sure? If it's quick.
Hi, I'm Shima. So when you look at the correlation between QBO and the tracer, besides the lag, do you consider using some sinusoidal terms to include the seasonality?
Well, yeah, we just get rid of the seasonality because this was, so this is sort of bandpass filtered between 1 and 5 years. So essentially, the seasonal cycle is removed in the time series that I'm correlating here at every location. So it's just those anomalies, that I think I can go back to, it's these sort of, there's no, if the seasonal cycle was in there, it'd be huge. And we're not as interested in that. So it's essentially not part of that correlation. No seasonal variability in the time series.
Yeah, it's maybe just because of the lag effect. It's not necessarily the seasonality of the data set, but because of that, the lag effect takes longer. Sometimes I've seen like for ozone, they have done like using different seasonal.
So the way there is a complication with the way the QBO phases up with the seasonal cycle can actually have an effect on how these are transported. So there is seasonality embedded in this transport for sure. And I think that's why the correlation, you don't necessarily do the best with one lag over a 2-decade time, because as the QBO is phasing up differently with the seasonal cycle, you have different transport times. So there is seasonality in here. I can't get rid of it entirely. It's in the transport. It's just not in the time series of the CFCs. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for coming and asking questions. Let's give Eric another thanks.